Those who are on Zoom, and is the sound okay? Yeah. Great. Some of you have had trouble getting in, as I did, through different construction and traffic and otherwise, so we're starting a little bit late, but so happy to have so many of you here. My name is Irene Goldman. I know most of you. I can't see who's on Zoom, but I'm waving. I'll see you soon. And I welcome you. I'm the board chair of the Coalition for Peace Action. I'm very excited to have all of you here for our membership gathering, and with anticipation to hear what Professor Rob Socolow will present for us today. I know you'll be fascinated and have questions, so keep your minds cooking as you always do. I'll sit down now, but before I do, I want to present to you Reverend Carol Haig, who is going to stand up and give us a few moments of motivation that she does so very well. And she'll be followed by Bob Moore, who will introduce our speaker and the program. So welcome to everybody in person, on Zoom, and enjoy the day.
Good afternoon, and isn't it a treat to have it be this beautiful day? I hope people at home as well as here are enjoying the sunshine and warmth. I was freezing and cold and wet yesterday, so this is a good day. We're here to celebrate today the fact that the coalition survives and thrives because of its membership. Everybody in the room and everybody at home who are members, we celebrate you and thank each other, because we wouldn't be here without this kind of wonderful support. And because today is a special membership renewal day, I want to especially honor anybody who is a new member. And are there any new members in the room? I was hoping to honor Ryan, who convinced his mother to both join Dana. And so these flowers are for Ryan and Dana. And if they come in, I hope we can give it to them. Is there anybody else who's a new member today in the room? I understand that the following people are new members, but you are online with us. John Braxton, Helen Evelo, Terry Lyons, Peggy Mish, Shannon Meagles, and Martha Specs. We tried very hard to figure out a way to give virtual flowers. And we just don't know how yet. Maybe someday it's going to be possible for me to hand it and for you to receive it, but I don't know how yet. So we're honoring all of our members, new and long time. And today, I'm trying to think, why am I giving today? And I'm giving today partly because of what I think I'm going to hear from Rob Socolow, because I've been watching that Doomsday clock for a long time. But even more than that, I'm giving today because of what's possible. I'm afraid enough about what can happen, but I'm much more engaged and encouraged by the fact that this organization may not be the only organization looking at nuclear disarmament in the state, but it certainly is the most powerful one. And we are recognized around the country. And if this organization keeps going and keeps strong, we have a chance to keep that clock from getting to midnight. And also today, we have an opportunity to do a little bit more than our membership, because we have been given a matching grant of $2,000. And if we can match those here, those of you at home, those who maybe heard about it in advance, if we can match, we can add $2,000 to plus what we give to keep the coalition very strong. And so, I seem to have forgotten. I have a basket. It's not quite an Easter basket, it's not quite a church collection basket, but I'm going to be at the back of the room to collect the physical donations that people would like to make. And there's going to be an item in the chat box. I always forget that. There'll be an item in the chat box that people who are watching from home can do. And what I am concerned to offer today, because Carl and I have been members for a long time, and we contribute to the coalition 4 times a year, but because this is a special membership day, and because we have the option of a match, I'm going to put our check extra into the basket. And I will hold the basket at the back of the room when we leave. You might have noticed that there's an envelope on your chair. You just might have seen that. Well, I have a couple of extras if you don't have one. And we will be able to complete those envelopes. And Jennifer or Jessica have pens. Would you put your hands up? And if anybody needs a pen, Priscilla, I'm sorry, terrible names. So they're extra pens, and I invite you to help make this Coalition for Peace Action stronger than ever, and to keep that doomsday clock down. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carol, and I'm Reverend Bob Moore, Executive Director of the Coalition for Peace Action. Thank you very much for being here. I want to just underline a few things. One is that the envelope that Carol referred to has multiple ways you could make your gift toward meeting that matching challenge grant of $2,000. You can do it through a check, through a credit card, which there's a space to put a credit card. Be sure to put the amount you want to have given to it. If you would like that donation to be tax deductible, you make it payable to Peace Action Education Fund, or PAEF. And then I also wanted to mention a category that Carol hadn't mentioned yet beyond the rank and file member. It's the very first thing at the top left. And so far this year, we've had 2 people use this option, which is a $1,000 lifetime membership. And the beauty of that is you give once and you don't have to write a check every year after that. You're automatically a member for the rest of your life. Now, one thing, additional thing for any of you who might be a little bit up in years, if you make that, that means you have to live at least 20 more years to get your money's worth. So it's a good incentive as well. I also want to lift up one final category of member, and this is an exceptional member. Is somebody here in the front row, Richard Moody. Richard is a former fighter pilot with both the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy. He spent quite a long time in that role. And then he had a transformation, a conversion, if you will, toward peacemaking, and has been doing that for some decades now. As a result of his peacemaking commitment, he's also become a Quaker. And the Quakers, you know, have a very strong peace testimony. They're one of the historic peace churches. And so he's reached out to some of his fellow Quakers, and he's also reached out to some of his fellow veterans. And he has recruited at least a half-dozen new members who weren't members of the coalition. Yes, that deserves recognition. So I want to lift up Richard as somebody who's exemplary. And, you know, one of the things that I've run into is I've talked to different people about what are the most successful fundraising strategies these days for nonprofits. You know, the topic that keeps coming up over and over is peer-to-peer. That is to say, what Richard has done, if others of us in this room start doing that, we can grow the membership. And by the way, that not only helps our financial wherewithal in terms of being able to conduct our work, when we meet elected officials, members of the press, one of their first questions is, how many members do you have? We have more clout when we increase our membership. So there's a lot of good reasons to do that. Now, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker in just a moment and get out of the way, but before I do, I want to give a special recognition and shout out to 2 interns that we have. One of them we have right now, and that's Priscilla. Could you stand up in the back, Priscilla? Let's give her a hand. She's a senior at the College of New Jersey, and she's been working with us in this academic year. And by the way, one of the roles that she has played is to help us with follow-up calls to members who have been asked to renew by email and by postal mail, but haven't yet done so. And Priscilla's been doing a fantastic job with that part of her work. But we also have a second intern that's with us. And Steve, if you can get ready to show Sophia here in a moment on the screen behind me on my right shoulder, Sophia DeCruz. She is going to be our intern this summer. And Sophia is currently a student at Syracuse University and will be with us all summer this summer. Sophia, can you? Yes. I think if you unmute yourself, you can say a few words to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. I'm Sophia. I'm a sophomore at Syracuse University. I'll be an intern this summer, and I'm really looking forward to working with the Coalition for Peace Action and getting young people involved in everything that you guys do.
Thank you so much, Sophia. We like hearing that. That's something we very much want. And Sophia's been working really hard on the climate crisis issue, which is something that a lot of young people are concerned about, justifiably so. Doesn't mean that the nuclear issue isn't a threat, but the threat that's on their minds, a lot of them, is the threat of the climate crisis and catastrophe that we're already entering. So before I introduce our keynote speaker, I just want to explain how the Q&A is going to work afterwards, so you know that. First of all, you folks in the room here are going to be the first ones who get to ask your question. And you won't have to do it by typing something into the chat box, because you aren't even at a chat box. So you will, when Rob's talk is over, Professor Socolow's talk is over, I will invite you to raise your hand and I'll number you off. And so we'll get the questions here in the room first. And you'll get to articulate that, but do try to keep it brief. But for our online attendees, who we're also delighted to have, our Coalition for Peace Action Vice Chair, Mark Tolo, is also online. And he will be looking in the chat box to select questions. You can type those in at any time during Professor Socolow's speech. So if it's in the first 5 minutes of a speech and that triggers a question, you can type in your question. And that will be considered for presenting to Professor Socolow. So now let me introduce our keynote speaker. Professor Rob Socolow is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Princeton University. He currently serves on the National Academy of Sciences Advisory Committee to the U.S. Global Change Research Program. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, an associate of the National Research Council of the National Academies, a fellow of the American Physical Society, which is the Society for Physicists, and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In 2003, he received the Leo Szilard Lectureship Award from the American Physical Society. Now, Professor Socolow finally is a member of the prestigious committee of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and by the way, the board chair for the Bulletin is here as well, which we're honored to have you as well. The prestigious committee that each year decides how to set its well-known Doomsday clock. His talk is entitled An Insider's View of Setting the Doomsday Clock. Let's welcome Professor Socolow.
What a lovely introduction, and what a special day for me. And thank you all for coming in spite of the gorgeous weather that should have made you make a different decision. So I will briefly set the stage. Then I'll tell you about this past year's clock setting. And then I'll give you some thoughts about what will influence me for the next clock setting. So the bulletin, the clock, and something called the Science and Security Board. The bulletin, you can read up on it. Many of you know it. Many of you are subscribers. Began in 1945. It came out of the Chicago Science Group, the Chicago nuclear weapon scientists. They were somehow less caught up in the fervor of the war and wrote a famous paper, the Frank Report. Happens to be the grandfather of Frank von Hippel, whom some of you know. Arguing we should have a demonstration, not actually use the weapon. And out of that came a group of scientists deeply concerned, politically involved, who founded the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, became a journal where the scientists shared their thoughts with each other and with the public about nuclear weapons and the nuclear threat. The organization remains in Chicago to this day, and it continues to have a journal, now bi-monthly, and a website where increasingly the attention goes. That's where we are today, freshened daily. The content was nuclear only until about for 60 years, so into the 2007-8 period, when they made a decision. Exactly who made the decision, I actually don't know, but Kenneth Benedict was in charge of the organization at that time. They added climate to nuclear. Kind of fateful decision. And then since then, because once you do that, you've opened the door to other threats, and the rest of the threats are called collectively disruptive technologies. And sometimes we say we have three groups, but disruptive technologies is on the verge of fissioning, I think, to have biological threats on their own and everything else, which will then fission. We have a chain reaction underway. There's a wonderful phrase in one of the bulletin statements that I copied out. What connects these topics is a driving belief that because humans created these threats, we can control them. That's pretty good. And we apply intellectual rigor to the conversation and do not shrink from alarming truths. The audience are scientists, policymakers, and the public, a triad, really, each one thought through on its own. It tries to be nonpartisan. There's nothing Democratic or Republican about a bomb or a cloud or an anthrax vaccine or bacterium. And we try to, and there's a difficult balance between American and global. We have deliberately non-Americans on at least the committee, the board that I'm part of. And that's tilts American, but it's trying to be global. And the third tension, I would say, is between the rallying the activists and what I call building the middle. The artist of so this is what the clock looks like. I cut out a page, I think you all know. And you'll see if you think about it that if we move it a few seconds, you'll have a hard time knowing whether this is the present version or the one back. The artist was Martil Langsdorff, and she was the wife of one of the activist climate scientists in Chicago. It is an extraordinary visual metaphor, succinct and successful. The clock is reset once a year with the intention of conveying whether the world is further from or closer to annihilation relative to the year before and relative to the sort of 75-year average of the problem. We meet once a year in November, and we explicitly to discuss the clock setting. A group of I'll explain who the group is in a minute. And in January we have a media event, and what's happened now is that it's a little like the Academy Awards. You build up suspense, and there becomes a media story covered more and more widely, it seems to me, every year. What is midnight? We had a conversation as a board not too long ago. We realized we had never discussed it, and we actually didn't particularly agree. and we better have a clearer view, but it's part of the story that this whole exercise is impressionistic and intuitive. It is not analytical and numerical. So we have been able to survive without a specific definition of midnight. It could mean anything from the annihilation of life on the planet to major disruptions that set us back a few years and we recovered. And within that wide space, I kind of think I feel it's somewhere in the middle for me. It's not as strong as extinction of the human species or life, but it's something like the end of human civilization, a loss of capacity to solve problems, setting back decades where we would try to be, not longer than that, the end of civilization. But as I say, that's kind of my working assumption. In 1947, when the clock first appeared, it was set back 7 minutes to midnight. It's been moved backward 8 times and forward 17 times, so many times not moved. Furthest from midnight was when the Soviet Union essentially collapsed, and 17 minutes to midnight, 1991. And when it was moved this year, it was moved to the closest it's ever been, from 100 seconds to 90 seconds. It moved from minutes to seconds to solve what we call the real estate problem. The real estate problem is you've got a certain amount of space, you can't keep cutting it down. If you limit yourself to minutes and you were 2 minutes, you were kind of done. So we went to 100 seconds and then to 90 seconds. The Science and Security Board was started at about the same time as we moved from nuclear only to nuclear and climate, around 2008. It had been one board with a combination of scientists and people who knew how to run and fund an organization. And the sense was we could improve both by having a science expertise that was collected in one place, and that set the clock. And the group of people who function as a board usually does, to keep the organization running, review the performance of the top people, above all find funds. That would be the other group. That's called the governing board. And the chair of the governing board, David Kuhlman, could you stand up for 1 second, has come today. He lives. He's in our community. So the November meeting is face-to-face, or Zoom to Zoom, but now we're trying to make it face-to-face. And there's lots of listening and some mid-moment polling, straw votes to see where we are, and then we keep going. And somehow, we whose professional worlds celebrate precise reasoning make ourselves comfortable with a process that is impressionistic and intuitive. How that happens, I'm not quite sure, but it actually works. And then we write a clock statement. And the clock statement is about 10 pages, tightly written and rewritten by the group with the absolutely essential services of a guy named John Micklin, who was the editor of the Bulletin, incredibly versatile and energetic and passionate man, who sits in on all our conversations and somehow distills it and then sends it to us as a draft, and then we rewrite it and send it back. I think we had 5 iterations this past year. And they're all online. And the past clock statements for quite a few years back are one after the other on a single page to link to them on the Bulletin's website. Right now there are 16 people on the Science and Security Board, not counting, I think 4, but I may be missing 1, ex officio members. We are matched to the areas of focus of the Bulletin. So we say, hey, we need to have we're losing somebody who knows something about climate. Let's find somebody else about climate. There's a term limit, 2 3-year terms. And so it's a vital process to find the next members. They tend to look for people who are recognized experts in their field and have an interest in the political and policy domain. In the climate area, where there are 4 of us, and 2 of them, I do not include myself by any means, are very, quite well-known, I would say famous climate scientists. The ex officio members are Governor Jerry Brown, who's spending more and more time with us, and you think he would be not available, but he's online when we have Zooms an amazing fraction of the time, and speaks up, has become some of the overall titular head. David Coleman, whom I just introduced, a gentleman named Sig Hecker, who was the head of the Los Alamos lab, and who runs something called the Board of Sponsors, which goes back to the 40s and is where lots of our Nobel laureates reside, and Rachel Bronson, who is the CEO and a spectacular lady. Successive chairs were Alison McFarland, who then left when Obama asked her to run the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, then me, then Bob Brosner, who has run Argonne National Lab, and now co-chairs Dan Holtz, who's an astrophysicist at Chicago, and Sharon Scassoni, who is an arms control expert. One of the other current Coalition Science and Security Board members is Alex Glaser, who is one of our community, member of the Princeton faculty, and part of this group as well. And there have been Princeton people in and out of the place. Okay, so we moved it from 100 to 90 seconds. In past years, except for this year's been an exception, in that every previous year that I'd been part of the conversations, which is probably about 5 times by now, because I was on it for a different cycle as well, maybe a couple more than that. We were weighing incommensurables. We could weigh, for example, the international response to COVID-19 against the buildup of North Korea's nuclear weapons. How do you do that? Well, impressionistically. But this year, it wasn't that way. We all agreed, I think maybe nearly all of us at least, that Ukraine had created a special issue, and that was going to determine where we were with the clock. Not because it was a war only, but because nuclear weapons had been introduced into the conflict, at least rhetorically. That President Putin had threatened to use the nuclear weapons as part of this war fighting. And that had not happened before, and for us, with our focus on nuclear weapons, this was a new ballgame. Quoting from the clock statement, several quotes: the war is eroding norms of international conduct. The possibility that the conflict could spin out of anyone's control remains high. A priority is to repair the geopolitical fissure which has opened up. And the US must keep the door open to principled engagement with Moscow. Principled engagement, geopolitical fissure, losing control, eroding norms. Some wonderful writing there. And the secondary consequence of the war is a retreat from global consciousness. The war has, quote, weakened the global will. More than just a fight. It's just the ways in which we've been dealing with all of the major threats has been with a sense that we're all in this together. And something, this concept of a geopolitical fissure makes sense to me. Climate change and all the others were in a subordinate place, but our clock statement gives each a section. The thing about climate change, when you're setting a clock, is that you could argue, and we do argue, that since we're getting more and more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we automatically get closer to midnight. I call that the ratchet. But then we have to do something else than that, because then we just sort of take over and we run out of real estate. So we've accepted that that's part of the background, and that what really matters is the capability to do something about it. Is that getting stronger or weaker? And with some of the we've had a sense that we were making progress until this year with the capacity to address these issues. The conferences of the parties of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we're being increasingly serious. commitments of countries to targets, whether rhetorical or not, were certainly in the right direction. But this year, the effect of the Ukraine war has been to lower the priority of climate change relative to energy security. Country after country is expanding their fossil fuel supply, going into pristine areas to do so in many places. And so you can't get an argument to push the clock back from this past year with climate change. Although for the past couple of years after that, it was kind of a little bit pushing back against other things moving forward. Pushing back meaning away from midnight and forward, closer to midnight. Biological threats. We had a special situation in that John Mecklin, our editor, had brought into the conversation about the pandemic a very influential article by a journalist who is roughly my contemporary. I've known him for years, named Nicholas Wade, who was a Brit, about the lab leak hypothesis. And so the Bulletin was conspicuously participating in the discussion of how the pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic began. And as you know, there are two contending hypotheses, and they really both can't be right. But we will probably never know whether it was the Huanan wholesale seafood market or the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They're apparently 40-minute drive apart. I don't know what level of traffic that would be in this metropolis of 12 million people called Wuhan, capital of Hubei state. But what matters, I mean, the public is fascinated with which one is right. It's clear that doesn't matter at all from the point of view of the bigger picture. Both are credible. Both are still routes to getting another pandemic. And we zeroed in, I think completely appropriately, because we're a group of scientists, on the lab leak hypothesis and its implications. Because because Wuhan lab is not all that exceptional as a virology lab. It had American government funding, as many of you know, for the investigator that was sort of closest to the subject. And there are apparently over 40 laboratories doing this kind of virology around the world, and nobody's saying that any of them gets terribly high grades for being careful. And we say only indirectly, but first of all, we say it is easier now than ever to obtain and modify pathogens. Problem is getting more frightening, not less. And then the writers of this section of the report created a three-way distinction. The leaks, or the movement of a bad agent into the human system could come from a natural source, or accidentally, or intentionally. Three different ways, each of which is serious and credible, and each of which needs all kinds of elaborate attention. The intentional one is biological warfare, and we have some norms about that. The accidental one is the one that has kind of been, people have paid less attention to. And one of the things that we realize is that the behavior of the biological scientists is a problem. The physicists have had decades to consider the moral implications of the nuclear weapons and developed an arms control community. Some parts of the biological world around cloning had a famous meeting in the Silomar and had a period in which they were not going to conduct research until they thought something through, and then they resumed. But apparently, the virologists basically say, leave us alone. We know what we're doing. We can take care of this ourselves. So we haven't written about that yet, but it was one of the frightening things I learned in the past year. There's something called gain of function research, which means the virus is better at hurting you than it was before after it has gained a function. That's quite a euphemism. So we call rather subtly for the establishment of agreed upon norms for scientific pursuit. That's a direct quote. which I think is really important. Under disruptive technology, it's a grab bag. We've discussed hypersonic weapons, which I know have been introduced into the Ukraine combat without a lot of special attention, but they are a new class of weapons. And we talk about the arrival of destabilizing satellite-based systems that can track missile launchers and other mobile targets, thereby enabling preemptive attacks. Space warfare is new and dangerous, and it's another threat that human institutions need to be developed to control. Okay, so I'm almost done. I want to speculate on what will affect my thinking about the nuclear risk when next November we convene again, about where to set the clock. And I'm going to not talk about biological threats because I don't know enough about it. I'll listen to my colleagues, or the other disruptive technologies. But I'll say something about nuclear and something about climate. So on nuclear, I remember writing the group at an intermediate draft when the phrase spinning out of anyone's control had shown up. I think probably John Micklin wrote it. I don't know that, but I said, don't lose that. It seems to me that's the most important phrase in the entire report, spinning out of control. Why? Because I had, and here I'm sort of in the middle of understanding something. The threat of using nuclear weapons is, I think, I understand it now to be more dangerous than I thought it was a year ago. And it was Putin's threat that brings about kind of what would happen anyhow kind of thinking. So over the past 75 years, we've constructed a global geopolitical system based on nuclear deterrence, and we do not actually have full control of that system. The use of even one nuclear weapon breaks a 77-year taboo and crosses a threshold. There's no mistaking a nuclear weapon from any other kind of weapon. When it goes off, there are isotopes that are produced that can't be on the planet for any other reason. So you know it's happened. And once that happens, as far as I can discern, there may not be any fire breaks to prevent global nuclear war. The technical phrase for that is escalation. Experts are not certain that they can contain a conflict that uses even a single nuclear weapon because of the potential for step-by-step escalation that does not terminate. When I ask experts whether there are missing rungs on the ladder, or to change metaphors, fire breaks, I get mumbling instead of certainty or clarity. Escalation seems to be a subject no expert is comfortable discussing with non-experts. I'm really a little baffled. You can see why a fair amount of what you would want to talk about would be highly classified, but the overall conceptual framework of thinking about fire breaks isn't at that level. So in November 2023, which is what we're in, and so it's 8 months from now, I will be deciding whether to advocate moving the clock closer to or further from midnight for 2024. And I expect my thinking to continue to be dominated by Ukraine. I will be inclined to move the clock forward toward midnight if the war has spread and nations seem to be concluding that threats to use nuclear weapons are effective. That could be contagious. And I will be advocating to move it back, as I suspect most of my colleagues will, if the Ukraine war has either ended or seems about to end. I will also want to move the clock back if there is evidence that the taboo against using nuclear weapons has become stronger. I wish I could believe that within the next 8 months, the militaries of the nuclear weapon states will begin collaborating to find ways to terminate every version of escalation. I would surely urge moving the clock back if that were to happen, but that does feel like wishful thinking at the moment. For climate change, I was recruited to join the Science and Security Board more than a decade ago because of my work on climate change. And and the decision of the bulletin to add climate change to nuclear power. And then whom do we get out there to join the people we have already? I was one of the people they thought of. But I said to the bulletin staff, it was a lunch over in La Years, actually, from the outset, that I thought nuclear war was a much graver threat. I came to understand that I was showing my age, which Bob said a few minutes ago. A younger generation populating the bulletin staff were much more worried about climate change. Their working assumption was that their parents' and grandparents' generation surely had figured out nuclear weapons and had taken nuclear war off the list of things to worry about. They really did, I think, did and do believe that this wasn't their responsibility, because it had been others' responsibility, and people did their responsibility, did their job. So there's a very different, bringing this back into the conversation. Well, Putin helped bring this back into the conversation. And the risks for young people are greater than for us older folk. They're talking about what they will experience when they are my age. It's Greta Thunberg, who's gotten old, has a very mixed reception among the people I know, is one of the people who changed the conversation about future generations. I've been working on climate change a lot, and responsibility of future generations sort of rolls off the tongue. But mostly these were abstract people in the 22nd century. They were rich. They had different tastes than ours. We couldn't think a whole lot about we couldn't do a very good job figuring out what they would care about. And so we could not worry so much. Greta says at the United Nations, "How dare you," meaning me. And my granddaughter says in softer language, "Grandpa, fix this." And so the future generations are my grandchildren, and they talk to me directly. So that is part of what's going on. If it weren't for this intergenerational conversation, I think we wouldn't quite have the kind of disconnect that we're facing at the present time. I will advocate moving the clock forward closer to midnight if new science points towards stronger, dangerous, positive feedbacks, like accelerating greenhouse emissions from the tundra. There's lots of carbon dioxide and methane to be emitted as ice melts in the Arctic, which is, the more ice melts, there's more release of gas. The atmosphere gets warmer, and more ice melts, and you get what's called a positive feedback. Or the gliding of Antarctica glaciers into the Pacific, into the Antarctic Ocean. And I haven't said this, but I'm kind of fixated on the fact that we don't do enough climate science, and that we should be learning faster, and we should have more probes in the oceans, in the atmosphere, in the ice, on the tundra, and more scientists in the field, and a more interpenetrating relationship between climate science and other fields like computer science and chemistry and everything else. I'm also worried about geoengineering showing up in the next 8 months. It's moving into the conversation. I don't know if all of you know even what the idea is, but it's essentially taking the planet and turning it into an engineered system that we fix for our benefit by tuning it. At the same time as we don't understand how fast bad threats are going to arrive, and we have major uncertainties, we want to actually take charge of the planet. It's premature, and if we're acting too aggressively about geoengineering, I might move the clock, argue for moving the clock forward just for that. But I'd move it back if leaders in government and the industry and the environmental NGOs are advocating effectively for more ambitious climate science. That would be really important, I think. And I'd move it back if we're working, there's a lot of posturing on this conversation about climate change right now. If we're going to get away from fossil fuels, that is a very tricky thing to do. We have to reduce the supply and demand somehow together, and you get them out of balance so easily, as happened in the last year, and especially in Europe. Managing the retreat from fossil fuels, taking it seriously, rather than somehow pretending it's going to be easy, would make me argue for moving the clock away from midnight. And then I'm puzzled by, I bristle at what I call noun inflation, similar to great inflation. We do use rather awfully easily today religious words: apocalypse, Armageddon, doomsday, as well as extinction and catastrophe. We've lost the high end of the vocabulary, and if we could somehow fix that, I think I would want to, because that's a sign of reality. And better, more careful conversation, I would be pushing toward away from midnight. So, couple last thoughts. One is that there is an argument. What we most of all do with a clock is raise awareness, and we promote discussion, and that is a clear good. But every once in a while, someone gives me an argument that we should go out of business. That especially young people are feeling futureless. That's a word I just learned. And that the clock may be contributing to that. And I don't think we want that kind of angst that leads you to want to have no children, and to feel very fatalistic and not get engaged and disengaged. And to the extent that the clock is doing that, we are part of the problem. So what can we do internally in this process to make that less an outcome of the clock process? And then I talked about the ambiguities of what we mean by midnight. We don't have a lot of conversation, including in buildings like this, about what we mean by the collective human future. There's a great deal in religion about the individual future, afterlife, and so forth, but not about the collective, what I call the destiny, what lots of people call destiny. There's a book that had an influence on me called The Children of Men by P.D. James, in which people become sterile, and there is suddenly a realization there's not going to be any more children, any next generation. And what does that do to people's sense of themselves? Of course, Margaret Atwood did some of the same thing with The Handmaid's Tale. I personally think we have a moral obligation to sustain human life and its intelligence on this planet. But you can make a utilitarian argument that if we could somehow gracefully disappear, not too much pain and suffering, that's okay. So we're somehow not drawing that conversation out, and yet it's the heart of the conversation that Bolton is representing with the concept of midnight. I see us as a treasure, where others see us as a menace. We may be the only instance of self-awareness in the entire universe, and I see our destiny to be a many-generation project to deepen this self-awareness. It seems right to end these remarks on a religious note, given where we have assembled today. Thank you.
Okay. And then I'll take the questions. Thank you very much, Professor Socolow, and I thought that was very stimulating and wide-ranging, and thoughts that had never occurred to me, you brought up. Good. And I thank you for that, because I think we all need those challenges of growing our awareness and our understanding. So as I said, what I'm going to do right now, and I already saw David Cohen's hand, so he gets number 1, number 2, Stephanie, 3, Dar, 4, Kip. Any other hands here for people? What are we up to? 5, I think, right? Yeah. Number 5, Elliot. Anybody else in the room want to be on the stack? Very good. Then let's start with question number 1. Oh, Ram, could you come up, and this way the people on Zoom can hear too.
Thank you. I've been in enough Zoom meetings to know that I need a microphone when I'm asking a question. So, as if we needed anything else to worry about, I'm curious whether the group has started to talk at all about AI as a threat, because, you know, there's been a lot of coverage of this survey that was done of AI researchers, and half of them identified the risk of AI posing an existential threat to humanity at about 10%. And so
What's the number, 10%?
about half of the scientists, there was a survey done at a conference of people working on AI, and my understanding is that the group that was polled placed the threat of AI creating an existential threat to humanity at about 10% over the next 10 years, 20 years. I'm not sure what the time frame was.
I have a funny answer. As I wrote this out, I knew it was too long, and I have the word cut for 3 paragraphs.
Good, you have the answer ready.
And I do. I note that we do not remark on artificial general intelligence in our clock statement. None of you will be surprised, I think, if the 2024 clock statement does do so. And I don't know, I think we have a few people on the board who would be knowledgeable enough to help us find our way here. We might really decide we had to have some additional person, because this has erupted in the very time since we did this work last winter.
So before we go to question number 2, and Stephanie, that's going to be you, just in defense of Professor Socolow cutting that, I said originally 45 minutes for his lecture, and then when I finalized things, I said maybe 40 minutes would be good, so I may be the reason that got cut, so.
40 minutes is better than 45.
Stephanie.
Yeah, I would like to know how you feel on balance the United States is doing as far as climate change goes. We have all of the positive rhetoric coming out of President Biden's mouth about all of the legislation, first time ever, all the incentives, et cetera, and then on the other hand, he approves massive drilling in the Arctic. And I just don't know how to balance this, and whether you think we're moving forward or backward.
Well, neither do I know how to balance it, but you've summarized the 2 most important things. Amazing new legislation from Congress, which will boost renewable energy in particular, with big subsidies. And you know, when I read about the Willow Project in Alaska, I'm again struck with we're not quite serious yet, because we are going to need to produce additional oil and gas. But there's a difference between going to places which are pristine, where there has been no development yet, and when you put in roads and so forth, you're committing yourself to 50 years, versus what I think is called infilling, which is when you go to Texas and drill more wells, or offshore in the Gulf, or maybe even in some places in the middle, in the Rockies, where there's already an infrastructure. So I don't understand why we can't, but I'm fascinated with this idea of middle building. And middle building would be what the NGOs would say, if we've got to get additional oil because we're going to have cars for this length of time and so on. But let's make that distinction. Then maybe Willow would not have happened. But it's this blanket we want to get rid of. All you guys are bad, and you can't, and nothing you're doing is going to ever get our approval. That makes that other conversation not happen. And as a citizen, you know, the U.S., we were not as clobbered by the price rises anywhere near the extent that Europe was. So we have been less traumatized, and responded less to the need for energy security. In fact, it's turning into but it's a great export opportunity for the U.S., which is, of course, in the wrong direction.
Thank you. And actually, just interjecting one thing before the next question, the people that you wanted to present the flowers to have shown up. Okay. Carol Haig, Reverend Carol Haig, if you could come up. And we want to honor some new members that are here. Ram, could you give Carol the mic? Use the mic, Carol.
I'm up over here. No. What you missed was that I offered flowers to new members, and I'm really proud to know that you got your mom to get organized to get you guys here.
Hallelujah.
So I want to offer you a flower of peace and hope, and a flower of peace and hope for you. And thank you for being here and joining us. Thank you. You're winning. I'm taking your mic.
Carol, thank you. I think it was worth interrupting the flow of our questions to get that in, so we're delighted to have you here as new members. Number 3, I think, was you, Dar, right? So, Ram?
Hi, Professor, thank you for your speech. I had noticed that you used the word "we" a lot in your speech. Many of these issues cannot really be solved except on an international level. And I wonder if you had any thoughts or comments about the diplomatic infrastructure that we have available right now. Has it gotten better? Has it gotten worse? What do we need going forward?
Yeah, well, as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change dates to 1992 in Rio, sometimes called the Rio Convention, and it's been pretty effective. All the countries joined it. One of the most important transitions over these 31 years was that initially there was a very deep north-south divide. There's something in that original convention called the distinction between Annex I and non-Annex I countries. It's just jargon, but Annex I essentially was the industrialized world. It wasn't the same as, it included Russia. And it had well over half the emissions of the world at that time. The growing pains of this organization have been in the direction of, we're all in one boat, all of us, not just the developed countries. And with all the legacy of colonial discussions, I call it colonial powers guilt and the colonized sense of entitlement. This has been a big struggle, but by the time of the meetings maybe 5 years ago, there is a sense that we're needing to do this in a coordinated global fashion. I think Obama gets some credit for getting that to happen. And now the emissions of the developing countries are more than half, and the growth of the emissions from year to year almost entirely in the developing countryside. So if we aren't taking that on, we aren't going to get anywhere. And the development patterns of the developing countries, new cities, new infrastructure, if they repeat what we have done, we're not going to get anywhere. And so we don't focus enough on the positive side. It's all about, will you give us money, and mostly about to compensate for suffering, which is a very good and important argument. But there's the argument about how we're going to get the developing countries' pattern of development to be a low-carbon pattern. I think that's the #1 priority, actually, of the international system.
Yep. All right, thank you. And who was questioner 4 over here to Kip?
Thank you very much, and I think this is a very interesting conversation that we're having. I think we need to have this conversation more often within our communities. I want to zero in on China just a little bit. 2 aspects about China. One is that they've been beginning to move into nuclear weapons using primarily fixed base weapons or weapons that can be moved around on trucks. Why is it that they're not looking at submarines or air as part of their triad, if they were to have a triad? Why are they initiating a fixed base situation when we're looking at moving away, some of us are anyway, moving away from a fixed base operation, because that means that everybody knows where our missiles are and can easily attack them. So that's one question regarding China. The other one is that China does not seem to be very concerned about global warming, because they see themselves as kind of a developing country, not responsible for all of the ills of the world, they claim. and they think they can get a free ride. And so we have no leverage to really get China to buy in. So what are your thoughts about what to do about China?
Well, the first question is extremely easy for me to answer. I haven't a clue. I am not at all even aware of what you just told me about fixed base development. Something I'm not tracking. Our friends, Frank von Hippel probably could, whom I worked with for over 50 years now, probably could give you an answer, but you're 2 steps ahead of me even in the understanding the question. On the second, I really don't agree with you. And I think the idea that we have to cajole everybody into this or that is when we as Americans, is pretty far out of date. The Europeans have led. China has bought into a low carbon future. There's a Chinese, I think, actually have said, when we make a commitment, we're really going to get there. And they have committed themselves to low carbon targets. They are going to use nuclear power in their own minds to get there, not just renewables. But they've set out, they're a planned economy. It's very different. When you make a commitment, you have a planned economy, you may well get where you said you were going to go. You could make a mess of it, but at least you have you have a blueprint. Whereas we're trying to get things done with our very much improvisational structure. And but at a deeper level, if China and India and other countries don't decide for themselves that climate change is bad for them, we aren't going to solve climate change. And bad for them does include bad for them as operating in a global economy. Not just how much are they going to have storms or something, but what about their trading partners and everything else? And China is I think, fully, the people who are making the direction deeply understand the climate change problem. The rate at which, I've been working with China informally and not that much, but enough to have seen incredible depth, change in the amount of familiarity and clarity and originality which these, primarily the technical people in Vice government, went from really having very little understanding of what it was all about to masters of it. Same thing goes for India, I think, as well.
Okay, we got one last questioner, and Elliot, yes.
Yes, number one, thank you very much for your information. I think it's great. Part of my questions were asked and answered by you, but there are 2 items that I would bring up. Number one, the concern about Biden's, what he has said about the Willow thing. There's another part of that is interesting to me, which does make some kind of sense, and that is that he is looking for a big trade-off and commitment by the oil companies to agree not to do any further exploration. So I think that modifies a little bit the concern that people have about Biden on this, although I am not very happy about what he even proposes at this point. And then the other thing that I would bring up, I'm sure everyone has read about Russia's proposal to put nuclear bombs or equipment into Belarus.
Right.
That's a very, very troubling thing to me.
Well, raised 2 very important points, and neither do I know a lot about. How you get an oil industry to commit to something isn't very clear to me. Mm-hmm. And I'm reminded of the phrase environmental movement that you can win battle after battle but still lose the war. But there is some kind of quid pro quo going on. I don't think I know enough about it to add anything. You certainly have been thought about it more. The Belarus story is, I gather, today's news, and I had not been aware of it. And it's obviously just what I mean by the widening of the war. Yes. In goes the clock. 80, 70, 60.
Yep. Thank you. And sit tight, because I thank the people online for your patience, and we are going to turn to you next. And let me just get this over here. Mark Tolo, our vice chair, is online, and I see him coming up on the screen now, and he is going to lead that part. So I'm going to sit down, and Mark is going to be reading questions that have been submitted through the chat box by the people online. We're doing pretty good on time. We're about 10 after 3. We will definitely be done by 3:30, and maybe even a few minutes before. So sit tight, and Professor Socolow, if you could stay here and use this mic to answer the questions after Mark asks them.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. I would like to not necessarily quote the questions, but to summarize them. And that I'd like to start with a question from Carol Woolman. Many of these have several parts to them. And let me make a personal comment here that I'm sort of amazed at how many different facets Professor Socolow has managed to integrate into a talk on what I thought was a fairly narrow topic, but it does range quite far. Carol has asked about a specific focus on the Ukraine war, and whether, in terms of that war, the environmental cost of the war, plus the fact that you have nuclear power plants there, which are essentially being held hostage as during this war, and the possibility of this somehow leading to a new nuclear arms race generated from the Ukraine war. Could you focus on the war in Ukraine and anything further that you would like to add to what you've already mentioned on that?
Well, I'll take up one of the parts of the question that I do.
Just look straight out, because that's what people on Zoom.
We're not picking up your voice.
I'll focus on one part of the question which I do have something to say about, and which was in the question, which is the nuclear power plants in Ukraine. It's been mystifying to me. It's a sort of a sign of how really undeveloped we are as a species, that we can't zone the reactors as non-military zones. The Zaporizhzhia is right on the Dnieper River. There seems to be both sides, or neither side, they can't find an agreement to say, we're not going to attack this. What it means for future of nuclear power, I don't know, but it's certainly not a good sign that it can become part of the war fighting. And I've tried to imagine what would happen if there was there's lots and lots of radioactivity at a plant. In this case, because it's been running a long time, there's something called spent fuel ponds, which are adjacent to the reactor, generally not as well protected by domes of cement and so forth. They're more likely to be the ones that break. That's what happened in Fukushima. And the radioactivity would, if it were the reactor itself, there might be enough heat to loft it into the air and go a substantial distance. But much of it's just going to go down and into water, into groundwater, flow into the Dnieper River, which is right there, down the Dnieper River into the Black Sea. It'll be measurable, because radioactivity is measurable in such small quantities, all over the Black Sea countries. Maybe go through the Bosporus as well. I mean, this is absolutely insane. And we don't react very well to trace radioactivity. We will overreact all over the place, because that's what we do. So the fact that we can't zone that out and say nothing's going to be shot in that general direction from either side is extraordinary to me. And the International Energy Agency has tried to get involved. One of you may know something more about this. I'd love to know. But when you're just reading that, here it is again, 2 months, 3 months later. It's right on the boundary of right at the battlefield line. And Chernobyl was a very different story. They tried to make a lot of the fact that Chernobyl, which is very well encased as far as I know, the radioactivity there, it's something called a sarcophagus. And it's not the same thing as this functioning reactor. I guess it's not running right now, but it's the radioactivity is there in very, very large quantities.
And Carol also has a follow-on, and that is based on what you've just said. Is 10 seconds difference between last year and this year, given what's going on in Ukraine, is that really sufficient, or is it maybe more dramatic than that?
Oh, we spent a lot of time on that question. It's the hardest. We didn't agree among ourselves, and we struggled. And one of the people, particularly influential in the group, changed his mind and got me more confused. But it's the real estate problem. If we used up 40 seconds and said, get people's attention, make it go from 100 to 60, what do you do next year? So it's 10 out of 100 is the way to think about it.
And another follow-up there, the IAEA director has people on the site, and apparently one of the big hazards is worker fatigue of the people who are supervising the reactors there. That's another aspect that she's wondering if you wanted to comment on.
It just ought to be simple to fix. I mean, the war is about deep interests of both sides. This is just being common sense. So yeah, I mean, worker fatigue can lead to an accident. The 3 Mile Island accident was created by people who were over their heads in what they were trying to deal with. In that case, what they were actually didn't understand what was in front of them. But worker fatigue could have the same outcome. We just put a valve in the wrong position. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Okay, I'd like to go to another question, which actually came from 2 different people, Roxana Vermel, and from Paris we have someone viewing. It's a professor who teaches on nuclear weapons issues, Dr. Benoit Pelopidas, and both of them have essentially the same question relating to how what had been focused pretty much purely on nuclear weapons by the organization has now taken on climate change and so forth. And the question is, do you consider climate change, the ramifications there, as a separate issue from nuclear weapons, or are they somehow intertwined?
Oh boy. So everything is intertwined. But I do think of them primarily as different, although when you talk about capability to solve a problem, institutional challenges, the ability to incorporate ethical frameworks into the solving of a problem, there's commonality, but I think they're 2 different domains. And the thing, I do worry about our paying too much attention to climate change relative to nuclear war. And I couldn't say that if I didn't think they were substantially different in what you had to take on.
Okay. Ed Aguilar has several questions, but one was, would you like to elaborate any further on the differences between different generations on the issues of climate, and how an intergenerational alliance might be part of looking at these problems in the environment and climate?
Well, that's a new phrase for me, intergenerational alliance, but it sounds like a very promising one. If maybe take your granddaughter to lunch, take your grandfather to lunch, and out of that can come pairs who commit together. It's a new idea to me, but I know I have 3 grandchildren. One in particular, my son warned me, if you give this talk and you sound a little soft on climate, you're gonna hear from her. She's 15 and she's been an activist since she was about 11. She got a prize for being an activist in middle school. So yeah, that's an interesting idea that since we've brought this thing home to the level now of it is about grandparents and grandchildren, maybe we should find a way to build on it more than we have. Good, thank you.
And from Jay Tyson, a question just came in that's related to generations too. This one with a little bit of, well, I don't know, implication perhaps. Do you take into account the age of leaders who have their finger on the nuclear weapon and the chances that any of them might have a mental breakdown that could result in the irrational use of nuclear weapons? Is that another generational issue?
I'm not sure why it's generational, but I have to say that, I'm sorry. I don't learn fast. I mean, people studied the behavior of missile silo commanders and so forth, and Bruce Blair, who was part of our group for a long time and passed as a younger guy, mid-60s or something, just a couple of years ago, had been a silo commander. And I don't know, I heard a little bit from him. He was certainly worried, and he had been there. It does take two people with turning keys separately, but who knows what the dynamic of that is all about. So I don't, and why this should be a generational question. Would people in there who were the missile silo commanders 25 years ago be in a different environment mentally from the present ones? So that's a question I've not thought about. Maybe some of you can think of a way in which it would be. I mean, it is different people, so would they be? Is their environment so different than it now? I don't know. But
I'd like to throw in a comment on that. That is, I saw something, a television documentary a number of years ago, where they interviewed the local commander in a missile site in North Dakota, I suppose, and asking this soldier, what do you think about, your situation there in a missile site, which really could have an impact on the entire world, what happens at your station there. And he said, yes, I do think that this probably gives me a little bit more responsibility than the normal 18-year-old would have. And that just scared everything out of me, that it was thought of in those terms, rather than something related to the entire world. It's just his sort of career opportunities. So I guess there might be another side to that question.
Let me add that there was something I didn't say, was one of those paragraphs, about disinformation. The Emerging Threats Group focuses our attention again and again on the fact that we're losing the confidence that we know a statement is true, and that the hardware to confuse conversations is better and better. And so I suppose this missile guy in the silo getting information electronically has new things to worry about if people can grab a hold of that communication and say things that are false, and he doesn't or she doesn't know it. So that is a difference that makes the current person's job harder.
And then we have a number of questions by Larry Holman, who was just prolific with ideas about what you've been talking about.
He should give the next talk.
Let me give a few of them at least that you might care to comment on or not. One is the idea of population growth. Does that in any way influence where you move the hands on the clock in terms of, the fate of the world, I guess? Secondly, economic growth. Does that influence things? the idea of renewable energy and versus continued subsidization of fossil fuels. Should there be more support for renewable energy? And these are just some of the topics that he's broached there. Would you like to comment on any of those?
I'll pick one, population. It is something I didn't include. I have this deja vu because I have had talks on this, generally roaming around this same space many, many years. And if I leave, then there'll be a question at the back, and someone said, "You haven't mentioned population." So I start. That was the most guaranteed, and I used to be careful not to leave it out. But it hasn't been part of our clock discussions, which is why I did leave it out. But in the last few months, we've had the news that the Chinese population has peaked. And in the environmental world I grew up in the 70s, this would have been cheered. Yeah. And how we have all this hand-wringing about how this community is going to get older and there won't be enough soldiers, and we are all going to get a more aged, heavy population, no matter even without the declining populations. But many of the countries of the world are going to shrink in population. There was nothing magical about growing an 8 billion or 9 billion and turn around and come down again gracefully to 2 or 3 billion in 100 years, 150 years, some number like that. We should welcome it. But we have to realize that society is going to be full of older people. Mr. Macron is dealing with trying to raise the retirement age by 2 years. It probably has to go up by 15 years. And then we have suddenly a workforce that isn't so unbalanced because, in fact, most of us are amazing fraction of us are productive past 62. So we've got a whole lot of rethinking about this population growth. It used to be all about extra babies in developing countries which had no access to birth control. But there is another whole conversation about the stabilization of the population and then it's shrinking in favor of older people.
Let's show Professor Socolow our appreciation again. That was excellent. Thank you very much. And even though we started 5 minutes late, I think we're going to end pretty close to on time. Let me just say a few things as we close. And Carol, I see you waving your basket. That was one of the first thing I was going to say for our in-person attendees. Remember to turn in your envelope to Reverend Carol Haig there in the back with her handy basket. If you do need a pen and don't have one with you to fill out your envelope, please raise your hand, and Priscilla, our intern this year, will bring a pen to you. If you are online, and by the way, for those in person, if it's whatever reason you're not going to go out that way, you're going to go out this door or something, you can always hand it to me. For the people online, please use the link in your chat box for making an online donation, or if you can't see that, just go to peacecoalition.org and look in the top right, the icon there, and you can make your donation for today's matching challenge of $2,000. You can make your donation there. Let me just mention a few things that are upcoming, some upcoming webinars. First of all, on April 11th, that's a Tuesday from 7 to 8:30, it will be an all-Zoom event with Ambassador Jack Matlock. He was here at the Institute for Advanced Study for some years. He's our last U.S. ambassador to the former Soviet Union, but he's been stationed all over the world. And his talk is titled, Distorted Vision, How We Won the Cold War but Lost the Peace. Very intriguing, I think. And then we've been talking a lot tonight, this afternoon rather, about the climate crisis issue. And we have been doing, and will do again this year, a Earth Week event. And Ed Aguilar, who was one of the questioners on the Zoom and is the leader of our Pennsylvania office, is organizing an excellent Earth Day webinar on April 19th at 7 p.m. That will also be all online. We have 3 excellent speakers, including a high school student who attended the most recent climate conference in Egypt, and I'm really excited about hearing his talk too. Last thing, as you leave, if you'd like to linger a little bit and chat a little bit with some of the other people here, from our service this morning, we have refreshments afterwards, and there were some leftovers in there. So if you want to linger a little bit, and I'm pointing to that room, it has a fireplace in one side of it. It's not lit, of course, now, but we'd welcome you to come and have a few snacks on your way out, too. Again, thank you very much for being part of today's event, both in person here and online, and we hope to see you again soon.